Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. They wanted to detain Lieutenant Colonel Negra, who was accompanying a dead soldier. Big mistake. In the small town of Ridgeville, South Carolina, summer lay like a leaden blanket over the low buildings and dusty roads. At the military airport, the tarmac shimmered in the midday sun, making the horizon ripple like a mirage. Despite the heat, everything was frozen, as if suspended in a moment outside of time. A massive, silent C-17 Globemaster III cargo plane had just landed. As the rear hatch slowly opened with a low rumble, an informal funeral ceremony was taking place in religious calm. The engines still churned gently, but no one spoke. Military protocol demanded silence. Respect. Attention. From the belly of the aircraft, a coffin draped in the stars and stripes emerged, carefully carried by 6 soldiers. Each of their steps was measured and solemn. It was the body of Sergeant Marcus Delaney, killed in action at the age of 24, during a reconnaissance mission in a volatile region of northern Mali. An ambush. A bullet to the throat. A moment of inattention, an eternity as the consequence. Beside the coffin walked a woman, Lieutenant Colonel Negra. Standing tall and imposing with dignity, she wore the impeccably pressed U.S. Army uniform, its insignia shining brightly across her chest. Her face was closed, but her eyes betrayed a deep emotion, held back by years of experience and discipline. Naomi was African American, the daughter of a former Army mechanic and a nurse from Atlanta. She had worked her way up through years of service, hostile missions, humanitarian response, loss, and survival. She had seen brothers fall, children cry, civilians die. But nothing dulled her sense of duty. That day, she wasn't accompanying a colleague. She was accompanying a soldier abandoned by the world. Marcus had no parents, no spouse, and no known relatives. He'd grown up in foster homes in Ohio before enlisting at 18. The Army had been his only family. And now he was coming home, with no one waiting for him. It was this idea that had broken something in Naomi when she saw her name on the list of the dead. No one was to make this final journey alone. It was an unwritten rule in the ranks: when a soldier fell, someone brought him back. And that someone temporarily became her voice, her silence, her witness. She had volunteered as a companion of honor, a sacred role in Army circles, though rarely discussed in the media. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a mission. It was a choice of the heart, an invisible but meaningful act of loyalty. She had watched the body being prepared, stood vigil overnight at his side at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Then she had flown with him, never taking her eyes off his coffin. On the tarmac in Ridgeville, she marched, perfectly synchronized with the porters. Each movement was codified, yet charged with grace and gravity. Her gaze never wavered. She bore the pain with elegance, for this young man whose life had been too short to know the honor she offered him. Naomi didn't know Marcus. But she knew what it meant to be invisible in her own country. To be black, poor, nameless. And she refused to allow this soldier, a brother, in the deepest sense of the word, to be reduced to a statistic. By accompanying him to his final resting place, she offered him much more than an escort. She gave him back his humanity. No sooner had she set foot on the scorching hot floor of the military terminal than Lieutenant Colonel Negra was intercepted. A man in uniform walked quickly toward her, looking hurried, almost disturbed by her mere presence. He wore a major's stripes and a name embroidered on his chest, Fallon. Richard Fallon, white, in his 50s, shaved head, set jaw, belonged to that generation of officers for whom appearance mattered almost as much as authority. Recently promoted, he wore his new rank like armor, swollen with an importance he hadn't yet mastered. His gaze flicked briefly down to Naomi's stripes, then back up to her face, undisguised by a certain irritation. "You are?" he asked, his tone dry, sounding more like a challenge than a real question. Naomi didn't squint. She stood straight, her gaze firm, posing her answer as a declaration. "Lieutenant Colonel Negra. I am here as a companion of honor." I am accompanying Sergeant Marcus Delaney to his final resting place. A short silence followed. Fallon frowned, stepped aside, as if to examine her in the light. He searched her gestures for something that would justify her discomfort, but found only discipline, rectitude, authority. He was not from your unit, he retorted, emphasizing each word like a boundary she had crossed without permission. You don't need to attend the ceremony. We'll take over here. Naomi inhaled slowly. She had heard that tone 1,000 times, in 1,000 situations. This wasn't military administration. This was contempt dressed up as procedure. This tone that said, you shouldn't be here. You're a blot on the landscape. But she didn't give up any of her calm. I'm responsible for Marcus until he's buried, she said calmly. That's what I promised. And I will keep that promise. Fallon pursed his lips, as if this statement had been a provocation. He briefly consulted a tablet he held at his side, then shrugged, feigning indifference. But he wasn't. He was trying to figure out how to dismiss her, how to justify his desire to exclude her from the protocol. Because, deep down, it wasn't what she did that bothered him, but who she was. A woman. Black. High-ranking. Unaccompanied. Conscious of her rank. And this, in Fallon's mind, challenged deeply held beliefs. This area is reserved for family and relevant officers, he said curtly, positioning himself slightly in her path, as if he could block both her body and her will. The silence that followed was dense. 2 soldiers nearby were discreetly observing the scene. One of them, a young Latino corporal named Rivera, gave a twitch of discomfort. He knew who she was. Many did. But Fallon clearly didn't know, or didn't want to know. Naomi looked at him for a long time. There was no anger in her eyes, but a calm, unmistakable intensity. She approached with slow, measured steps and spoke in a barely audible voice, but each syllable resounding like a hammer blow. Major Fallon. What you see is a uniform. What you question is the honor of a commitment. I'm here for a fallen soldier. And I don't need your permission to love him like a brother. He stood frozen. An almost palpable tension was building, and something flickered in Fallon's eyes. He understood, dimly, that he might have just crossed a line. But his ego held him back. His newly acquired status, his fear of being challenged by a black woman, all of it still kept him from backing down. But soon he would have no choice. As Fallon was about to raise his voice to impose his authority one last time, a deep, slow, and restrained voice rose behind him, cutting like a saber through the silence. Major Fallon. I suggest you consult Lieutenant Colonel Negra's service file immediately. The major froze. The voice came from the entrance to the briefing room, and it carried with it that rare weight of those who no longer need to raise their voices to be obeyed. Naomi didn't turn around. She knew exactly whose voice it was. Fallon, however, whirled around, his face contorted with irritation, before paling slightly. Standing before him was retired General Carlton Hayes, a man whose name alone was enough to silence any headquarters in the country. The man was white, tall, broad-shouldered despite his age, dressed in a simple navy suit. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his piercing blue eyes exuded the quiet clarity that came only with time and bloodshed. Hayes advanced slowly, a walking stick in hand, a left knee injury from an assault in Kosovo that Fallon would have known about if he had read more than his superior's career summaries. General Hayes, stammered Fallon, suddenly straightening up, posture rigid, hand almost trembling in half salute. Rest, Major. You're not the one being honored today. The tone was neutral, but each word struck with surgical precision. Naomi then turned her head slightly, barely managing a smile of respectful gratitude. Hayes positioned himself between Fallon and her, like a human barrier against stupidity, then turned to Naomi, nodding. Lieutenant Colonel Negra, it's an honor to see you again. I missed you at Fort Drum. Naomi replied in a sober, humble tone. The honor is mine, General. I'm sorry about Marcus. Fallon, increasingly uncomfortable, searched for words like a soldier searching for an exit in a minefield. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, I just thought that, well, protocol requires. Hayes raised a hand to silence him. Slowly. Firmly. You've already done it, Major. And you know it. A long silence followed. And let me be clear, this woman you just belittled with your arrogance commanded troops in 3 theaters of war. In Iraq, she saved a battalion surrounded for 36 hours under constant fire. In Afghanistan, she evacuated an entire village of civilians, led by children, under fire, with a single helicopter that had a rotor failure. And in Somalia, she led Operation Echo Dagger. You know what that was? No? I forgive you, because if you had known, you would have kept quiet the moment she set foot here. Fallon lowered his head, flushed crimson, panting. He remembered now, Echo Dagger. It was a top-secret mission for years. Hundreds of civilian lives saved. A direct negotiation with a warlord. Commanded by a woman. That woman. Hayes continued, in a lower but even more serious voice. 2 silver stars. A bronze star. A Purple Heart for a chest wound while protecting a younger soldier. She received personal letters of commendation from the president. She served as a senior auditor at West Point after training 2 generations of officers. And she's here today, not for the accolades, nor for her reputation, but for a fallen soldier, one no one expected. The old general then slowly approached Fallon, looking him straight in the eyes, and finished in a softer, but implacable voice. And today, she confronts you with what you failed to see, your ignorance. Then he turned to Naomi, his hand resting briefly on her chest. Thank you for being there, Naomi. Even the dead aren't alone when you're by their side. She tilted her head slightly. Fallon, for his part, had nothing more to say. He had just been silenced, not by the hierarchy, but by the evidence of his smallness in the face of true greatness. A few hours later, the sun began its slow descent, softening the light on the green hills of Ridgeville Memorial Cemetery, a meticulously tended military cemetery where every white stone seemed to carry a story. The air was warm, but the wind had picked up, gently caressing the American flags that fluttered in muted tones. On a lawn marked by black ropes, Marcus Delaney's coffin, draped in a carefully folded flag, lay on a dark platform, surrounded by silence. Around him, dozens of soldiers had gathered. There were no relatives. No widows. No photos pinned to the seats. But there were brothers and sisters in arms, from several states, sometimes in civilian clothes, sometimes in uniform. Old soldiers with hunched backs, young ones with straight shoulders, field medics, convalescing soldiers leaning on crutches. Some didn't know him. Others had crossed paths with Marcus once, maybe twice. But all were there out of loyalty. Out of principle. Out of moral duty. And at the center of this assembly stood Lieutenant Colonel Negra. Straight as a pillar of honor, hands clasped behind her back, uniform perfectly pressed, boots aligned on the ground. She still wore her insignia, but without pride. That day, she wasn't there as a superior. She was there as the guardian of a sacred silence. When the bugle sounded, slow, deep, heartbreaking, a pent-up emotion rose in everyone's throat. The first notes of taps, that funeral music that closes lives too short, floated in the air like a wordless prayer. Naomi moved forward slowly. Her boots barely crunched on the short-cut grass. Reaching the coffin, she reached out a white-gloved hand and gently placed it on the varnished wood. The gesture was simple. But it carried the weight of a promise kept. Then she whispered, in a voice that only those around her could hear. You may not have been known here, Marcus. But you were a brother in arms. And you won't go back alone. Her eyes, which had seen the horror of war, then let a tear fall. A single tear. Silent. Dignified. Authentic. She remained like this for a few seconds, motionless, then took a step back, straightened up, and raised her right hand in a rigorous military salute. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped their singing. The men and women present saluted in turn, in spontaneous ranks. There were no ranks. There was no longer any distinction. There were only hearts aligned in respect. Then the flag was folded slowly, with religious care. 3 corners, 13 folds, and finally the perfect triangle. An officer handed it to Naomi, since there was no one else to receive it. She took the flag as a shrine, clasped it to her chest for a brief moment, and then placed it herself on the grave. A military priest read a short prayer. Then silence returned. Naomi stepped back, letting the earth be poured out. A handful. 2. 3. And in that ritual, there was something more powerful than any medal, a community of souls, gathered together to prevent oblivion from covering one of their own. The sun was now low in the sky. It bathed the Ridgeville Military Cemetery in an orange, almost golden light, as if the sky itself were giving Sergeant Delaney a final salute. The guests had dispersed, some slowly, others silently, their faces drawn, their thoughts heavy. Naomi Negra was moving away in turn. She walked alone, her cap in hand, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if she were still carrying Marcus on her shoulders. In her other hand, she held the carefully folded flag, a triangle pressed against her chest. But as she reached the cemetery gate, a hesitant voice spoke behind her. "Lieutenant Colonel Negra?" She stopped. Turned around slowly. Richard Fallon, the major who had tried to push him aside a few hours earlier, stood there, his face drawn, his uniform a little wrinkled, his gaze visibly shaken. He was no longer the self-assured superior who handed out orders without nuance. He was a man facing his own limitations, a soldier forced to look in the mirror of his own ignorance. He took a few steps forward, without daring to cover the whole distance. I wanted to apologize. What I said, what I did, was unacceptable." He took a deep breath, as if the next words burned his throat. "I didn't see your worth. Worse. I reduced you to what I thought I saw. An appearance. An impression. A prejudice." Naomi stared at him. For a long time. There was no anger in her eyes, but an icy clarity, like that of a doctor who sees a deep, but not yet fatal, wound. She answered in a calm, collected, but firm voice. "Respect is not given because of decorations, nor because of titles." She paused. "It starts with a very simple thing, Major, don't assume." Fallon bowed his head. He had nothing to say. Everything had been said. He had been wrong on every count. And this day, supposed to be a tribute to a fallen soldier, had also turned into a moral test for him. A confrontation with his own smallness. Naomi, however, didn't linger. She turned on her heels, her posture erect, her appearance supple, dignified, unwavering. She didn't try to humiliate. She didn't reach out. Because it wasn't about punishing, but about letting silence do its work. Fallon watched her walk away. He understood, at that precise moment, that he had just encountered true greatness. Not that of stripes. Not that of medals. But that of character, forged in the heat of trial, polished by humility, tempered by courage. He stood there for a moment, motionless, alone at the edge of the cemetery. Facing his own lessons. A year later, in the same April that Marcus Delaney was laid to rest, Ridgeville Air Force Base held a sober but profoundly meaningful ceremony. On that day, soldiers, officers, military families, veterans, and enlisted civilians crowded into the renovated wing of the main administration building. At the entrance to this new wing, a room had been set up in memory of the man few had known personally, but everyone had learned to respect, Sergeant Marcus Delaney. The room was bright, its walls covered with portraits of fallen soldiers, but in the center, a large framed photo drew everyone's attention. It showed Marcus, young, smiling, in uniform, standing in front of a dusty Humvee during a deployment in West Africa. Beside it, an American flag under glass. One of his handwritten letters, sent from the base in Gao. A few personal belongings, a notebook, a posthumous medal, a pair of training gloves. But what most imposed silence in the room was the bronze plaque fixed to the black marble wall, just to the right of the entrance. Deeply engraved letters proclaimed: "Here was honored a soldier without family, but never without a brother or sister in arms. Thanks to the loyalty of Lieutenant Colonel Negra. He was not forgotten." Each word echoed like a whispered prayer on behalf of all those who, like Marcus, had left behind only their uniform and the memory of their bravery. In the crowd gathered for the ceremony, Negra stood in the front row, upright, serene, soberly dressed in a dark gray military suit. She hadn't wanted to speak. She had simply agreed to be there, as a witness, in memory, in silence. But everyone knew that without her, this hall would not exist. It was she who, after the funeral, wrote personally to the Pentagon, launched a collection to fund a memorial space for soldiers without families, and convinced the officers and bureaucrats that dying alone should not mean dying forgotten. And at the back of the room, leaning against a wall, discreet, without visible stripes, stood Major Richard Fallon. He was no longer the same man. That day, he didn't speak. He listened. He didn't place himself at the center. He observed. He had traded his clumsy authority for a rarer posture, that of a man who had understood, belatedly, the value of silence and learning. Fallon had been one of the first to contribute to the Delaney Foundation, created by Naomi to help young soldiers who were orphaned and without family support. He never spoke about it. He wasn't looking for public redemption or recognition. He simply wanted to contribute, this time, in the right way. And when the ceremony ended, Fallon stood alone in front of the plaque for a few moments longer. He reread each word, slowly. Then he looked up at Marcus's photo and whispered almost to himself. "You had a sister in arms. And I had a lesson to learn." He stepped back, gave a brief salute to the plaque, then disappeared into the crowd. Naomi, without looking back, knew he had been there. She had never waited for his public apology. She had preferred discreet change to theatrical repentance. And at that moment, in the quiet of the room, a truth became clear. Even those no one expects, can become immortal, if someone stands up for them.